Standing tall and looking good.
Standing tall and looking good.
Ought to be in Hollywood.
Ought to be in Hollywood.
Standing tall and looking good.
Standing tall and looking good.
Ought to be in Hollywood.
Ought to be in Hollywood.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Wake up, we gotta go.
Wake up, we gotta go.
Whoa.
This is Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall from the Wignall Group and the F.C. Tucker Company. On this show, we walk you through the process of home buying, maintenance, investing in real estate, and selling your home. Each week, we'll be joined by one of our platoon of local real estate experts to inform us about the various facets of the real estate industry.
I'll watch you with my back.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Wake up, we gotta go.
Wake up, we gotta go.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
And welcome to Mastering Real Estate with your host, Master Sergeant Brian Wignall from Wignall Group Real Estate and the F.C. Tucker Company. And my co-host here is Matt Lawtus, the owner of Pillar to Post Home Inspections in Indianapolis.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. To date, we have been talking about the home buying process and all the various steps involved in that. A little bit later today, we're going to talk about home inspections, my favorite subject. But Brian, why don't you bring us up to date on kind of where we are so far?
Absolutely. One of the things that we got into last week, and we'll go over it again here today, we're dealing primarily with buyers at this point. What is the step to buying a house? And the steps to buying a house, the first step, find a good agent. We did talk about some of the things to look for. Responsiveness, someone that does this full-time, somebody that's experienced and successful. Number two thing would be find a broker or a lender. Get a pre-approval, not a pre-qualification, so you know what you can buy and what you're eligible for. Once you start looking at houses with that agent, once you find a house and put in an offer, the very next step is going to be to schedule a home inspection. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is the home inspection process.
Excellent. Well, that is my area of expertise. So you want to just dive right in? Do a deep dive on home inspections?
Absolutely. One of the things I think is going to be important for you to share with people is what are some of the things that you look for in a good home inspector? Similarly, to what we were talking about with things to look for in a good agent. Now, I can tell you as a real estate agent, one of the things that's really critically important to me when I am working with home inspectors is not just their ability to look at a house and find any defect or any potential defect, but it's also the ability to mitigate emotion with anxious buyers and be able to explain, what the findings mean. What is this? Because I know with an inspection report, if you have a 30-page inspection report, but a lot of that stuff is simple items, your average first-time home buyer is going to be scared to death, and he's going to think that house is about ready to collapse on itself. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the term I would use is actually, and this is going to sound very generic, is professionalism. We are definitely going to talk more about this today, but everybody kind of misunderstands the home inspection business. The reality of it is that we're kind of 1/3 home inspector, 1/3 psychologist, and I just completely forgot what my third point was going to be.
Memory expert.
Yeah, which doesn't sit well with a 55-year-old brain. 1/3 psychologist, and my 55-year-old brain just kicked back in, and the last third is we are 1/3 teacher out there in the field. So essentially, we have to be able to take a house that may be in good shape and may not be in such good shape and explain to people what we've found, explain to them how that impacts the house, and then simultaneously with all of that, we have to be able to kind of do it and lessen the emotions in the room, because those emotions are what is eventually going to blow up that deal. So when I say professionalism, that's what I really mean. In all honesty, it's actually really easy to become a home inspector. There is a very low barrier to entry in this business. If you look online, you'll see it sold as it's just looking at houses. You can only do it where you can do it with just a few hand tools. That is technically true, but there is way, way more to it than that. And that kind of attitude doesn't foster that professionalism. Kind of the analogy we use in my business is if you have to send your kid in for a tonsillectomy, Do you want an experienced surgeon or somebody who's just out of a Caribbean medical school? Obviously, you want somebody who's a professional that's been doing this, for quite a while. I am sure we'll talk more about pricing later on, but just like everything else we've talked about on our shows thus far, a good home inspector is not going to be a cheap home inspector. We always tell clients you should look at three things. Are they good? Are they cheap? And are they available? And you can usually pick any two of those, but you're not going to get all three of those in a good quality home inspector. So a home inspection is not what most people think it is, but maybe Brian can talk a little bit about some of the more common misconceptions he sees from his clients when it comes to the inspection process.
Well, one of the questions that I hear a lot from buyers is, which inspector can we hire that will find any potential problems with this house? And honestly, Matt, unless you move into that house for 3 months and live in it, are you going to find every single potential problem on a house doing a 3-hour inspection?
No, this is going to come as a shock to most people buying a house, but we are not going to find everything or know everything there is to know about that house in, 1 3-hour inspection window. And like Brian just said, the only way to do that is to move into that house and live in it for 6 months or a year or 2 years, because that house, it ages and changes just like everything else out there. So one of the biggest misconceptions we end up fighting in the inspection business is that we're going to know everything about that house as soon as we walk, or our clients are going to know everything about that house as soon as the inspection's over. And in fact, home inspectors often sell their services that way. You give me 3 hours with that house and you'll know everything you need to know about that property. And that just isn't the way it works. If you think about, say, an older house where a couple built it maybe in the 1940s or 1950s and they've lived in that house this entire time, when they move out and a family of 4 or 5 moves into that house, it is going to stress that house in completely different ways than it's experienced in the last few decades. So you will never know everything about that house walking out of a home inspection, and yet they're sold that way all the time.
Now, is it important to set expectations with buyers when you're talking to buyers about the whole inspection process?
It's important to set expectations throughout the entire purchase process, but it is especially important to set expectations as it regards the home inspection process.
Now, I know one of the things that I do with buyers before home inspection, because as we've talked about on other shows, buying a house is generally the most expensive purchase that you're going to have, and there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. So generally my conversation with clients before I have them contact you or another inspector and get an inspection done is, on this house that we're looking at that's 20 years old, anticipate to get an inspection report that's 40 to 50 pages long. And the big art of the inspector and the agent that's going to interpret that report is let's weed through that report and find out what are big things and what are some things that aren't critical. For instance, I've noticed that on almost every inspection report that I see, people talk about anti-tip brackets on stoves. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, anti-tip brackets are these little brackets that kind of bolt your stove to the wall. They were really critically important, like the 40s or 50s maybe, because stoves used to be top-weighted. So a gas stove that's top-weighted, little kids could crawl on them and pull them out of the wall, and then you've got a breached gas line, and that's a big problem. Well, stoves nowadays are bottom-weighted, and not all stoves are gas. Actually, a majority of them are electric or inductive, so not as critical. And if you order a stove from your average hardware store or appliance store, most of them that I see get delivered, they're not putting those brackets on. But you guys are still responsible to list that on that report, correct?
Correct, but it all depends on how you end up listing it on that report. So this starts to delve into the psychology of how you write up an inspection report. The theory behind that anti-tip bracket was, if you've got a pot of water for spaghetti boiling away on the top of that stove, a kid could come along, open up the oven door, step on the oven door to get to the top of the stove, and have the whole thing come tumbling down on top of him, getting scalded by the water and the burner as that happened. The reality of the situation is, that's a really far-flung scenario, and the chances of something like that happening are super, super remote. It's like the warning label on your lawnmower that says, do not carry this onto the roof of your house to blow snow. Somebody did that somewhere along the way, and now we've got that warning label. So we do have to report on things like anti-tip brackets for stoves or damper clips on gas fireplaces, which is another bugaboo. But deliberately making those a major item in the inspection report and scaring people about it, when the reality of it is it's a super easy fix and a super inexpensive fix if you want to do it, really reflects how you as an inspector look at houses. It goes back to that psychology we're certainly going to talk more about today. Do you want to panic people over little stuff like that that's really easy to fix? Or do you want to highlight what may truly be an expensive, hard-to-fix problem with that house? So
Absolutely.
Listing stuff like that as major scary items, not something we do. We'll put it in the report, but it's not something we're going to want to emphasize.
Well, it looks like we're coming up to our first break here. When we return, we're going to be continuing this conversation on home inspection with Matt Lottis, the owner of Pillar to Post Home Inspections. You're listening to Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall and Matt Lottis from Pillar to Post. If you have any questions about real estate or anything regarding the real estate industry, please text them to 317-797-3580, and we'll feature those on a future show. You're listening to Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall and Matt Lottis. And welcome back to Mastering Real Estate with your host, Master Sergeant Brian Wignall with the Wignall Group Real Estate and the F.C. Tucker Company, and my co-host, Matt Lottis from Pillar to Post Home Inspections. Now, Matt, we're talking about the home inspection process, and what I'd like to kind of delve into before we talk about what an inspection is, why don't we talk about what a home inspection is not?
So if you guys are already tired of listening to me talk, and you want the spoiler alert version of this or the too long didn't read version of this, a home inspection is not what you see on TV. What you see on TV is overly dramatized, and the guys on those shows do things that we never do in the real world. So sometimes it's easier to define what something is by first talking about what it's not. So we touched on this already, but a home inspection is not an exhaustive list of defects and issues. Think of it as more of a high-level overview of what should be big stuff that might come back to bite you in the rear end about that house. A home inspection is certainly not a guarantee of any kind, because there are always going to be things that we can't see during that inspection. Seller's stuff is going to get moved, revealing parts of the house we couldn't see before. The weather's going to change, and the snow is going to melt off that roof that we couldn't see. Stuff like that is just going to happen. So a home inspection is not a guarantee or a warranty of any kind. Things can and will break after an inspection. So that dishwasher may be running fine when we test it, but it may also be on its last legs, and some hidden component of that dishwasher fails shortly after you move into that house. Defects, in quotation marks, are going to become apparent later after that inspection, and that is truly nobody's fault. It is just the way that that house kind of wears and how things settle in when new folks move into it. And a home inspection is certainly not a tool for buyers to beat up sellers. We get this all the time, especially over the last couple of years with people paying premiums for houses, that I want you guys to nitpick this house because we paid way too much for it and we need something to help beat the sellers up with. So I'm sure Brian's got some experience with that and will counsel against it, but maybe he can give us kind of the broker point of view on that particular negotiating tactic.
Well, that negotiating tactic, just to let everybody know, is called nibbling. What nibbling is?
Did not know it actually had a name.
There's a name. There's a name in negotiation circles, and that's where you nitpick, ask for more until the seller says, "Forget it, I'm done. Let's do a mutual release and move on to somebody else." And then at that point, you know that you've gotten that seller to give everything they can give. Now, as a collaborative agent, I generally don't ever do that. I like to be very collaborative. I like all of my transactions to be a win-win, because if it's a win-win, everybody feels good. My buyers have an easy transaction. They're feeling really happy about the transaction they have. The sellers are not feeling like they were taken advantage of. It's a much more peaceful transaction. But a lot of those agents that just want to win, when you want to win, that means somebody has to lose. And they will do that. And quite honestly, if I'm the agent that's representing the seller, we're gonna do that mutual release much quicker than you're anticipating, because the stress for my sellers isn't worth going back and negotiating, renegotiating, and renegotiating again. It's a bad choice, I think.
So that brings up another question for me. Well, actually, from me to Brian, because honestly, this is a real pain in the butt of most home inspectors. Is it a good idea for the buyers or for the buyer's agent to give the sellers a full copy of that home inspection? The reason I don't like it is because when they do that, the sellers are inevitably going to call me and explain why something isn't really broken, why something isn't really a defect. They'll tell me how they were going to get it fixed, but it really hasn't been a problem, so they never have. Or they'll ask questions about where it is, what they need to do to fix it, and I can't even talk to those folks without getting my clients, usually the buyer's, permission to do so. So as a broker, what are your feelings on that?
I personally think it's a bad idea for a couple reasons. Now, if I'm in a transaction and everything is going along very well and we're just dealing with a couple items, yeah, I might get permission from my buyers to send the whole report to the seller. If it's a stressful negotiation, I don't do that, because I've seen situations before when the sale doesn't go through where those sellers will then take my report that my buyer paid for and pop that under supplements on their listing, and they're basically using that report as a pre-listing inspection, which it's not. It's something that was paid for and owned by my buyers. So I generally don't send the whole report unless it's a real peaceful transaction and everything's going in a very collaborative manner.
Yeah, and we've got a pretty hard and fast rule internally that if that deal does fall through and subsequent buyers get a hold of that report, we're just not going to discuss it with them, period. Because we have no, I don't want to say responsibility, but that's the only word I can come up with. They're not our clients. That's not their report. So basically when that happens, use it at your own risk. Yep. So awesome. Well, we just talked about what a home inspection isn't. Let me spend a couple minutes talking about what a home inspection is, because this is going to lead us to a very important part of this discussion. So what a home inspection actually is a visual inspection of the major systems of the house. It's not an exhaustive little list of every cracked faceplate or plate on an electrical receptacle. It is one person's opinion regarding the condition of the home at the time of the inspection. So we can't see into the past, we can't see into the future, so we're looking at that house kind of in the now or in the moment. A lot of people don't do this in my business, but realistically, a house should be evaluated relative to its peers, kind of in context with its age, its location, and a whole bunch of other factors. So the plain English version of that means that we can't look at a 100 or 150-year-old house in Fletcher Place or Fountain Square the same way we look at a brand new build out in the suburbs. Opinions amongst inspectors, even in the same business, can and will vary, so no two reports are ever going to be identical. The home inspection probably is not what most people think it is, so the discussion we will have later, either later in this show or later in another show, is how do we align all those expectations coming into this with the reality of the inspection process. But the neat little kind of wrapped up with a bow summary of what a home inspection actually is it is nothing more than information tempered by one inspector's opinion that should really be used to help buyers make a more informed decision about that house. That seems very simplistic, but at the root of it, that's really all it is. It's information tempered with a little bit of opinion.
Now, Matt, one of the things that I was going to bring up in our conversation today is I am a firm believer in the importance of inspection. We were talking a couple weeks ago on would you ever recommend someone waive an inspection on a purchase? My answer was absolutely not. I have never recommended that with clients. In fact, I've talked clients out of doing that. I think there are ways to have an offer accepted without doing that. And I want a house purchase for my buyers to be a blessing, not a curse. Because guess what? If they have a great transaction with me, they're probably going to refer their friends to me, their coworkers, their relatives. That's how I stay in business. I don't stay in business by having a single transactional relationship with somebody. Now, to go along with that, one of the things that I do a lot is called a pre-listing inspection. And I had actually heard about that first through one of your training events, and I do that religiously with everything that I list. And what a pre-listing inspection is, for people that aren't familiar, is it's basically the listing agent talking to the seller and talking the seller into doing a complete home inspection before the property is listed, and them paying for that. I think that does a couple things. First of all, we have a lot of people relocating to the Midwest from other areas. A lot of these people are buying homes sight unseen. So if I'm listing a house and I have an inspection done by a reputable company that's uploaded on my listing, it gives people that are bidding sight unseen a feel of security putting an offer on that house. But number two, and just as big of a reason, is I want to make sure, as an agent representing you, if you're selling your home, that if there's any kind of problematic areas on your house, we find out about that before a potential buyer does. Now, I have a specific story to tell about that. I had a client of mine named Fred. This was a couple of years ago. He was selling a house that he was actually the original owner on. It was built in the 60s. And I talked to Fred about doing a pre-listing inspection, and he thought that was just ridiculous. Why would I pay a couple $100 to do this? I've been in this house since 1968. I know this house backwards and forwards. I helped put this, he had all these reasons on why it was a bad idea. Now, I knew Fred, with what he sold, with what he made on this house, he was going to be using this to fund his retirement. But he absolutely did not want to do a pre-listing inspection. Now, we got an offer very quickly. It was above list. The people hired an inspector, as they should have. And what we found out is Fred, my client, for years used to take cardboard boxes that he received things in through the mail, and he would break the boxes down, and he would store them in the crawl space. Well, what do you get when you take a lot of corrugated cardboard stacked up in a moist crawl space? It was a moldy mess. Now, when the buyers found that, they wanted to have a mold mitigation company come in and mitigate all of that mold. And the estimate that he received to do that was $3,500. Now, if we would have found all those boxes before the house was listed, I could have had a general contractor probably go in there for a couple $100 and clean it up. But because we didn't, and because the buyers were the ones who found that on inspection, he was responsible for paying a mold mitigation company over $3,000. So have you seen situations like that where people have saved a lot of money doing one of those pre-listing inspections?
I have absolutely seen situations like that. I just made a note. We'll have to talk about mold, and it's a whole other show on its own. But I think you actually missed two of the most important benefits of that pre-list inspection. And we will talk about those as soon as we get back from this break.
If you have any questions about real estate or anything regarding the real estate industry, please text them to 317-797-3580, and we'll feature those on a future show. You're listening to Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall and Matt Lottis. And welcome back to Mastering Real Estate with your host, Master Sergeant Brian Wignall with the Wignall Group Real Estate and the F.C. Tucker Company, and my co-host and guest today, Matt Lottis, the owner of Pillar to Post Home Inspections in Indianapolis.
So I'm serving double duty today. So in our last segment, we were talking about pre-listing inspections and why they're so important, especially in today's market. And I said that Brian missed something, and actually he didn't. He touched on both of these things, but most people don't think about them when they think about a pre-listing inspection. The two biggest benefits in my mind to doing a pre-list inspection are, number one, you as the seller of that house get to control the costs of the repairs. So in a traditional buyer's inspection, we talked about this last week, after we do that inspection for the buyer, they have a chance to respond, and part of that response is figuring out how much it's going to cost to fix all of this stuff. In a pre-list inspection, you'll know what's wrong with that house, and then you as the seller can decide how to fix it. And realistically, when we look at those numbers, it easily costs, and this is going to sound like an exaggeration, but I swear it's not, twice as much to get something fixed in the heat of negotiation when that transaction is going on than it does to be able to take your time and pick your contractor when you're just putting that house on the market. So people tend to shy away from pre-list inspections because they're afraid of what we're going to find. But the cost benefit to doing that, to controlling those contractor costs, is huge for that seller. So number one, there's a big financial incentive to do it. You said that Fred said, why should I spend, several $100s to get a pre-list inspection done? Well, because it's going to save you thousands of dollars when you go to do that mold remediation that you talked about. The second big thing, the big advantage to doing a pre-list inspection is, and nobody realizes this, it actually buys you some, let's call it protection against the not-so-professional inspector who might come around later. So one of the reasons, or one of the services that we offer when we do a pre-list inspection, is you basically get us as consultants when that house actually sells. So we do the pre-list inspection, some other less professional inspection company comes along and tries to blow up that deal later on because they call that anti-tip bracket a huge major item, or that damper clip a huge major item, or God forbid you don't have GFCIs in a 1950s ranch house. Those kind of little things that scare people, the seller can call us. They can tell us what's going on. We can write a very reassuring email or put something on letterhead that says these are very easy fixes. They're not a huge deal. And it just makes that whole transaction go much smoother. So essentially, you've got us as consultants all the way through that sales process. And let me tell you guys, there are a lot of unprofessional inspectors out there who honestly like to blow up deals. There are actually, I hate to say this, but I have heard over and over again in my business, guys that will say, well, if I blow up the first deal, they're going to like me so much, I'll get the second transaction and then the third transaction. We help sellers defend against that.
And Matt, it's interesting that you said that, because one of the things we talked about in our first show about things to look for in a good agent is an agent that is collaborative. You have people that are adversarial. They just want to win, even when it's at the expense of their clients. And I think the same thing with home inspectors. You have home inspectors that want to find these things and make a big deal because it makes them look like more of an expert, when the best thing is going to be that inspector that's able to say, hey, you don't have an anti-tip bracket on your stove, and you don't have a damper clips in your fireplace. But honestly, if you look at the 50 houses in this subdivision, 46 of them probably don't have anti-tip brackets and damper clips. Not a big deal. But yet you still got the ability to say, hey, that crack in your foundation, that is a big deal. And you've got the ability to do that, as opposed to just try to prove what an expert you are by blowing up a transaction and costing someone a house that could have been a really nice house for them.
Yeah, that kind of attitude leads to forest for the trees syndrome. I have seen, I can't even tell you how many inspection reports where guys have just nitpicked that house to death, and they write up that anti-tip bracket, or the house doesn't have weep holes in the brick veneer. And long story short there, they weren't really required till the early 2000s. But they miss the foundation cracks. They miss the big stuff on the house because they're so focused on proving themselves to be the experts in all the little minutia of home inspection that they miss the forest for the trees. They miss the big stuff for trying to document all the little stuff that's going on with that house.
Now, we were talking about setting expectations on the home inspection. One of the things I do with all of my clients when they're getting ready for the home inspection is I will sit them down, and if the house is within 5 years of being new, I'm going to say you're probably going to get 20 pages of defects on the inspection report. And if it's over 10 years old, I'm telling people you're probably going to get 50 pages of defects. The art is going to be to go through all of those defects and determine what's a problem, what's not a problem. Now, I know on your inspection reports, you guys will generally separate stuff into, things to watch or major items. Now, is a major item always something that we should be really concerned about, or could that still be things that are not necessarily a big deal?
No, there's a real danger in my business. Guys tend to use too many adjectives to describe the defects that they find. You'll see them listed as safety and maintenance and monitor and minor and major. The problem there is that usually the defects that we find can fall into any number of those categories. So we only list them as minor and major items. And major is typically anything that can affect the immediate safety or habitability of the house. It can be anything that, if it's not corrected in the near future, could be much more difficult or much more expensive to correct. Or it can be anything that potentially is going to cost a lot of money to fix. So even something marked as a major safety item could be a really cheap and inexpensive fix. We see old dryer gas lines all the time where they forget to just put a cap on the end of that abandoned valve. That is technically a major defect, because if that valve gets bumped open, you can fill your house with natural gas or propane and have a serious fire situation. But it's a 79-cent brass cap that you can get, pretty much at any hardware store and put right on there. So calling something minor or major doesn't really always denote that it's going to be a big, scary, expensive fix. So part of the real art of writing an inspection report is how you determine what you call minor and major, because that also changes with the age of the house. It honestly changes sometimes with what's top of mind in the inspection and real estate business these days. So the definitions for those are very fluid, and there is very much a real art to how you write up that inspection report.
Now, Matt, dealing with inspections, one of the things we talked about in one of our other shows was the importance of inspection with new construction. That's one of the key reasons why people should always have a realtor that's personally advocating for them. A lot of people will go in, they'll look at a house that's either 1-2 years old or something being built, and why should I have an inspection on a brand new home? Shouldn't that be perfect?
The house should be as perfect as imperfect people working with imperfect materials can make it. So keep in mind that no house is perfect, even a brand new build. And that is especially true in today's world, where we're still experiencing some pretty severe labor and material shortages. So we see bad lumber used all the time. We are seeing right now, to be perfectly honest with you, some pretty serious foundation problems that in 17 years in business, I think have kind of peaked. I've never seen this many foundation problems before. And a lot of it is coming because we're hurrying to build so many houses. They're just not taking the time and hiring the professionals they need to, because those folks just aren't available, to do that kind of skilled labor of pouring that foundation. I'm actually going out tomorrow to look at a brand new build foundation where the slab has cracked and is out of level almost 3/4 of an inch within about 4 feet. And it doesn't sound like much, but the framing crew on that house literally told the superintendent, we can't frame this house, and they went ahead and did it anyway, because there's that much of a demand for houses. I get pictures of cracks in floor slabs from my guys every day. It's just become a real issue in the new construction business. The root of it all, honestly, is material shortages, labor shortages, and that extends to the superintendents building those houses. Typical load for a superintendent in new construction these days realistically he shouldn't be responsible for more than 10 houses really at any given time. There's just so many things that go into that building that house, that's staying on top of it. You can't do it after 10 houses. Superintendents today, I regularly talk to guys who have 25, 30 houses that they're responsible for. Talked to a guy 2 weeks ago who had 27 houses, 22 of them in McCordsville and the other 5 in Plainfield.
Wow. On
the complete opposite side of town. So even in new construction, there are absolutely things that we should be out there looking at.
And I would even come along and say, even with very, very reputable builders, and even on much more expensive builds, this is a real critical step. I had a client of mine that was building a house that was $650,000 plus a couple years back, which of course nowadays would probably be an $800,000 house over the last 2 years of appreciation. But we had a 25-page report during our pre-listing inspection on items that needed to be addressed. And we had to have, I think it was your crew, we had to have your crew out probably 6, 7, 8 times to keep re-inspecting, because the subcontractors that they were using kept missing stuff in the process of repair. So that was important to me and my buyer to make sure if there were any critical issues that builder fixed those before we closed on that house. looks like it's time for our next break. So when we get back, we're going to be talking a little bit more about home inspection with Matt Lottis from Pillar to Post Home Inspections. This is Mastering Real Estate. If you have any questions about real estate or anything regarding the real estate industry, please text them to 317-797-3580, and we'll feature those on a future show. You're listening to Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall and Matt Lottis. And welcome back to Mastering Real Estate with Master Sergeant Brian Wignall with the Wignall Group and the FC Tucker Company, and my co-host and guest today, Matt Lottis with Pillar to Post Home Inspections in Indianapolis.
Guys, I realized that we have forgot to mention our text number. So I tend to be pretty opinionated as an inspector, and if you want to tell me how absolutely wrong I am about something I just said, feel free to text us at 317-797-3580. If you want to tell Brian how right he is about stuff, feel free to do that as well. Or, you know what, if you want to tell me how right I am about stuff, that would be awesome too. But again, that number is 317-797-3580.
Now, Matt, my next question here is, during the inspection process, who should be at the inspection?
So I wish I could take credit for this, but it was actually a very wise broker who works for the same company that Brian does, who basically says that in his opinion, all parties buying the house should be at the inspection. So that includes anybody with a financial interest in the home and anybody who has been part of the entire home buying process. So what we mean by this is if your parents are loaning you the money to help buy that house, they should be at the home inspection, but only if they have been part of that entire purchase process so that they know and they understand all the ups and downs you've gone through to get that house, to get that accepted offer. So the neat, again, kind of short version of this is anybody with a vested financial interest in that house, if they have been part of the entire process, should be at that inspection. If they've not been part of that entire process, then they really shouldn't be at that inspection. We kind of want all those people there to learn about the house. There's two parts to every inspection. There's the written report that, everybody thinks that's what the inspection is, but just as important is actually the verbal communication during that inspection and as we're presenting that report, because that's where we explain why we wrote what we did and kind of our thinking into writing up that defect or that issue the way we did. Why did we make it a minor? Why did we make it a major? So if an involved party is not at that inspection to hear that explanation, to go through that house and actually see those things, it's very, very easy to take that report out of context and easy fixes get blown out of all proportion. So anybody that's got a financial interest in that house should be there at that inspection with the caveat that they've been there for the entire process.
Now, Matt, conversely, we just talked about who should be at the inspection. Conversely, who should not be at the inspection?
How long do you want me to go on about this? The easy answer here is anybody who has not been part of the entire home buying process should not be at the inspection. So if your parents, even if they're providing a little bit of assistance with down payment, haven't been with you to see all the trials and tribulations you've gone through to get that house, to know what else is out there on the market in comparison to what you're buying, they shouldn't be at that inspection. So anybody who hasn't been part of the entire home buying process should not be at the inspection. And again, I wish I was the one that came up with that, but that is kind of the distillation after talking to some brokers I really trust about this entire process. The other folks who should not be there at this inspection: contractors, carpet dealers, interior decorators. None of those people should be at the inspection. Contractors have an unfortunate habit of really keying in on their area of expertise and making it sound like the sky is falling. So a contractor at an inspection can blow up a perfectly good deal. They also have a habit of breaking things that then you as the buyer are going to get blamed for. Carpet dealers measuring stuff shouldn't be there. Again, interior decorators shouldn't be there. All of that distracts actually from the inspection process. The one guy I really don't want to be there for the inspection is Uncle Joe, who used to be a builder, or is an electrician, or is an HVAC tech, because for whatever psychological reason, those guys always like to inflate their importance. And again, they key in on their area of expertise and make it seem like the sky is falling. So those people that have not been involved in the purchase process really have no business being at that inspection. And then the final two categories, I will mention that we don't like to see at inspections. Kids, unfortunately. Yes, I know this is going to be their future home, but that inspection is a long, boring process to a kid, and they can't play with the toys of the kids that are in that house now. They can't get in the pool, and yeah, we've seen both of those things happen. So really, your kids shouldn't be at that inspection. And then the last one, and I can't believe I even have to say this, but this is the world we're in these days, your pets do not belong at that inspection. And people bring their dogs. I've seen people bring their cats. I've seen people bring assorted other animals to inspections with the reasoning that, well, this is going to be their future home and they want their pets to be comfortable in that house. That's all well and good, except the pets that are already in that house usually don't like competing pets or interlopers in that house, so please do not bring your pets to an inspection.
I have an additional one for your list. This is probably one that you've kind of overlooked. And I'll tell you the quick story. Had an inspection. We had two people that were at the inspection, the buyer and one of his relatives. And we were looking at a vacant house. I wasn't at that inspection, but I was on the phone with the inspector. And the relative decided to go in the basement of this vacant house where there was a beer fridge and start slamming beers. What he didn't realize is that there was a camera down there because the homeowner was afraid that his kids were going to do the same thing. And so I had to negotiate the tension out of the fact that my guy's there with a relative, there's an inspection going on, and he slammed 3 or 4 beers down in the basement. So do not bring relatives not involved with the transaction that like to drink beer out of beer fridges.
I wish I could say that's the first time I've heard of that happening, but we have literally had that happen at inspections before. We have had clients go into somebody else's fridge and help themselves to a snack. And no, they were not, neighbors buying each other's houses. These people were completely unknown to each other. So there is also an etiquette that goes along with the inspection process. That actually would be a good show at some point in time, would be not just real estate transaction etiquette, because a lot of people don't know, what that is and how they're supposed to act in certain situations.
Well, I was glad the inspector called me and told me about that in advance before I got chewed out by the listing agent, but felt sorry for the inspector. He's like, Brian, I don't know how to break this to you, dude, but I think he slammed 3 beers, maybe 4. So I was going to just buy a 6-pack and drop it back off at the house, and I was like, nah, I'll let the agent know, and luckily I did because it was all on film.
Yeah. Well, and that actually brings up another really great point. In today's world, what we tell our inspectors is always assume you're on camera. Now, that should, in a perfect world, be disclosed by the people selling that house, but it is oftentimes not. And you can be very surprised sometimes where people have cameras in their houses and, what gets recorded. Why don't we talk for a second here? I'll give you my maybe controversial opinion here first, and then Brian can chime in from his perspective on brokers and agents at the inspection. So I am a firm believer that your agent, if it's possible, should be at that inspection. Now, they don't have to attend the entire inspection because it is kind of a long 3-hour process, and a good broker is going to be busy. But they've been told for years and years that agents shouldn't be at the inspection because it confers some kind of liability on them. And the truth of the matter is that if that deal goes so sideways that you end up in court, everybody is going to get sued whether they were at that inspection or not. So because that communication aspect of the inspection is so important, I firmly believe an agent should be there if it is at all possible for them to be there, at least at the conclusion of that inspection. I've had to make far too many phone calls to an agent saying, hey, buddy, your clients are completely freaking out because they didn't know this about a house, and it's really not that big a deal to fix, but they're ready to walk away on the deal. So it's all about showing your value as an agent to be involved in that process and to at least be there for the wrap-up of the inspection. Now, I know that if you're a busy professional agent, that's not always possible. So, Brian, why don't you tell us about that aspect of it? What happens if you can't be there at the inspection?
Well, I think at minimum, because a lot of agents aren't able to be there for that whole inspection. I think at minimum you need to be in direct communication with the home inspector. Part of an agent's job is to mitigate emotion and explain things just as well, just like the inspector. And so you need to really know what's going on with an inspection so that you can adequately go through that report and kind of explain that to your buyer. So yeah, I would say at the minimum, if you can't be at the inspection, you need to be on the horn with the inspector before you talk to that buyer, and you need to understand all the nuances of that house.
You should also never buy a house sight unseen, but hopefully we're past those days of the crazy market that we've all been in. Guys, that's our show. Thank you so much for being with us. We have barely scratched the surface of home inspections and, well, honestly, in real estate in general. The more we talk about this, the more I realize how much there is to talk about this. So thank you so much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate you listening, and we'll talk to you next week.